Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive into aphantasia. It's where some people just can't picture things in their minds. We've got research papers, interviews with folks who actually experience this, and we'll even take a look at what people are saying online about it.
It's amazing how much this topic is popping up online.
And get this, you might think not being able to form mental pictures would be a total roadblock.
You think so, right?
But a lot of people with aphantasia dream vividly, and some even excel in visual fields like art and design. It makes
Mhm.
you wonder, how does that even work?
Right. It challenges what we assume is critical for things like creativity and imagination. That's what we're going to try and unpack today.
Okay, so before we get into the how, let's define aphantasia. What exactly is it?
Aphantasia is the inability to create those voluntary visual mental images. But it's important to remember that it exists on a spectrum. Some people experience total aphantasia, their mind's eye is totally dark. And others have what we call partial aphantasia, where they might see faint or fleeting images, but nothing like the vivid pictures that most of us just take for granted.
So there's a range of experiences, not
Yeah.
just an on-off switch.
Right.
That makes sense. But how many people are we talking about here?
Well, research is still fairly new. The term was only coined in 2015, but the current estimates suggest that somewhere between 2% to 4% of the population might have aphantasia to some degree. That's millions of people. And the most fascinating thing is that many people only figure this out about themselves much later in life.
I bet that can really throw you for a loop, suddenly realizing that your experience of the world is totally different from what you thought was normal.
Absolutely. It reminds us that even the most basic things like how we think are so much more diverse than we realize.
Okay, so let's say someone thinks they might have aphantasia.
Yeah.
How can they find out for sure? I mean, you can't exactly look inside someone's brain and see if they're picturing something, can you?
Right. It's tricky because it relies so much on self-reporting. One common tool is something called the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, or the VVIQ. People rate the vividness of their mental imagery on a scale.
I see. But with any survey or questionnaire, there's room for different interpretations, right?
Exactly. People might understand the questions differently or have trouble accurately describing their experience. That's why researchers are looking for more objective measures. One promising area is brain imaging studies, like fMRI, to see what's happening in the brain when people try to visualize.
That's interesting. But wait, if someone can't visualize at all, wouldn't their brain just be completely inactive when they're asked to picture something?
You would think so, but studies using fMRI have actually shown that people with aphantasia show reduced activity in the visual cortex during these tasks, not a complete lack of activity.
So the visual part of the brain isn't offline, it's just less engaged.
Exactly. This suggests that while the machinery for vision is all there, it's just not being activated in the same way during mental imagery.
Okay, so we're starting to get a picture, no pun intended,
Yeah.
of what might be going on inside the brain. But what about outside the lab? How does aphantasia affect people in their daily lives?
Well, it's important to dispel the myth that aphantasia is a disadvantage. In my work, I've met so many people with aphantasia who lead rich and successful lives. Artists, writers, scientists, engineers, you name it.
Wow, that's really impressive.
Yeah.
But how do they pull that off if they can't visualize?
It seems to be all about adaptability and finding different approaches. For example, a software engineer with aphantasia might not see lines of code in their head, but they might excel at breaking problems down into smaller steps, organizing information in a way that works for them.
So they're finding different mental tools to compensate.
Absolutely. And some even say that aphantasia gives them certain advantages. For example, some interior designers with aphantasia have told me that they rely more on tactile experiences,
Hmm.
building miniature models, really focusing on the feel of textures and spaces.
It's amazing. It shows how adaptable the brain can be, even when faced with something that seems as fundamental as not having a mind's eye.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to a pretty interesting concept, meta-imagination.
Okay, meta-imagination. That sounds complicated.
It's basically the ability to act as if you're visualizing, even if you can't consciously see a picture in your mind. In other words, people with aphantasia can engage in activities that seem to require visualization, like describing visual details or solving spatial problems.
So even without that picture in their head, they can still think spatially.
Exactly. It's almost as if their brain is running a simulation in the background, even if they don't see it.
I remember reading about a researcher who was talking with someone with aphantasia. He asked the person to imagine a ball on a table and then someone pushing it off. And the person understood the concept but couldn't describe any visual features. But when the researcher asked about the color of the ball, or the person pushing it, or the size of the table, he could give those details. It's like he was making up the image as he went along.
That's a great example. And it shows how language and how we ask questions can really shape these responses. It's as if the person with aphantasia has learned the rules of the visualization game and can provide details that fit even if they're not seeing it in their minds.
But if they're not visualizing, are they essentially just making things up? Like, how are they coming up with those details?
It's not really making things up. Remember, their vision is perfectly normal. They've seen balls, tables, people pushing things countless times, so they have that knowledge stored.
Ah, so they're using their memory and their understanding of the world, even if they can't access it visually in the same way.
Exactly.
This is also fascinating, this idea that mental imagery can be so different for some people. It has to have some pretty big implications, right?
Mhm.
Not just for aphantasia, but for how we think about the mind in general.
Definitely. Aphantasia challenges so many assumptions we have about thinking imagination and consciousness itself. It's a powerful reminder that human experience is far more diverse than we tend to think.
Well, that's a pretty thought-provoking note to end on. I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation. We'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll dive into how aphantasia interacts with things like dreams, emotions, and even mental health. Welcome back to our exploration of aphantasia.
It's great to be back.
We've been talking about what it is, how it's studied, and how people adapt to a world that so often assumes we all see things in our mind's eye. But there's one area where this gets really interesting: dreams.
Yeah, dreams are a fascinating aspect of aphantasia.
Because it seems counterintuitive that someone who can't visualize while they're awake could have really vivid dreams.
Right, you'd think that if you can't picture things in your mind, you wouldn't be able to see them in your dreams either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet, many people with aphantasia report having dreams that are full of visual details.
That's right.
So how does that work?
Well, it seems that different parts of the brain are involved in dreaming compared to voluntary visualization. So even if the visual cortex is less active when someone with aphantasia is awake, it can still become very active during sleep.
So it's like different parts of the brain are running the show depending on whether we're asleep or awake.
It seems that way.
That's so interesting. But if people with aphantasia can have these visually detailed dreams, do they remember them differently? Like, are their dream descriptions less vivid or less detailed compared to people who can easily visualize?
That's a great question. And research suggests that there's no significant difference in the level of detail or vividness of dream descriptions between people with and without aphantasia.
That's really surprising.
It is. It makes you wonder if our brains have other ways of processing and storing those dream experiences, maybe through emotions, narratives, or other sensory modalities.
You mentioned emotions. I'm curious about how aphantasia might relate to mental health. We already talked about how people with aphantasia aren't immune to things like anxiety or depression.
Right. It's important to debunk that myth.
But are there specific ways in which aphantasia might help or hinder someone in terms of their mental health?
That's an area where more research is definitely needed, but some studies have suggested that the absence of visual imagery might actually be beneficial in some situations. Yeah. For example, with conditions like anxiety or OCD, where intrusive thoughts and images can be a big problem. The lack of those really vivid visual images might act as a kind of buffer, reducing the intensity of those experiences.
That makes sense. It's almost like their mind has this natural filter for those distressing visual elements.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But what about the other side of the coin? Are there any potential downsides?
There's been some discussion about whether aphantasia might make certain types of therapy more challenging, specifically therapies that rely heavily on visualization techniques, like guided imagery or exposure therapy.
Right. If you can't easily picture something in your mind, those techniques might not be as effective.
Exactly. But skilled therapists can definitely adapt their approaches to suit different imagery abilities. They might focus more on verbal processing or sensory exploration, or use metaphors and storytelling.
So it's about finding what works best for each individual.
That's the key.
We talked earlier about how people with aphantasia can be successful in fields that you might think require strong visualization skills. But I'm wondering how aphantasia might affect someone's learning experience.
That's a great question. While traditional visual learning methods like using diagrams or illustrations might not be as effective for some people with aphantasia, they often do really well with other approaches like auditory learning, verbal reasoning, or problem solving.
So relying too heavily on visual aids could be a problem.
It could be.
What are some alternative methods that might work better?
Things like lectures, discussions, and hands-on activities can be really helpful. There's a great anecdote about a student with aphantasia who was struggling with geometry until they started building physical models. Manipulating the shapes in 3D space is what finally helped them understand the concepts.
So it's all about adapting teaching methods to different learning styles.
Absolutely.
And that really highlights how important it is for educators to be aware of aphantasia and other cognitive differences, to make sure everyone has the opportunity to learn and succeed.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about a potential link between aphantasia and ADHD.
Yeah, that's come up a lot.
I know they both involve differences in things like attention and executive function. But is there any evidence for a more direct connection?
Some researchers believe that the overlap might be due to shared neurological pathways or underlying mechanisms. For example, both aphantasia and ADHD have been linked to differences in dopamine signaling, which plays a huge role in attention, motivation, and reward.
So disruptions in those dopamine pathways could contribute to both conditions.
That's one possibility. Another theory focuses on working memory, which is the ability to hold and manipulate information in your mind.
Right.
People with ADHD often have difficulties with working memory. And some researchers think that a weaker working memory might also make it harder to form mental images, because it takes a lot of working memory capacity to hold a visual image in your mind.
It's like the mental canvas they'd use to paint those images is just not as accessible.
That's a good analogy.
But it's important to remember that this is still an area of active research. We need more studies to fully understand the relationship between these two conditions.
Absolutely.
And of course, not everyone with aphantasia has ADHD, and not everyone with ADHD has aphantasia.
Right. There are distinct conditions.
Now, I want to come back to something we touched on earlier, the whole issue of language and how it can be tricky when we're talking about something like mental imagery.
Yeah, language can be a real double-edged sword.
Because we often rely on these visual metaphors to describe how we think.
Exactly.
But those metaphors might not make sense to someone who doesn't experience mental imagery in the same way.
Right. And this can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings.
It's almost like trying to explain the taste of chocolate to someone who's never tasted it before. You can use all the words you want, but they'll never truly understand what you're talking about.
That's a great analogy. Aphantasia really highlights the limitations of language when it comes to subjective experience. It forces us to acknowledge that words can't always capture the richness of our inner world.
And this makes me think about memory. We often associate memories with visual images, those mental snapshots of the past. But what happens when those snapshots aren't there? How do people with aphantasia experience memory?
That's a fascinating area of research. Early findings suggest that people with aphantasia might rely more on other forms of memory, like verbal or semantic memory.
So instead of recalling a visual image of, say, a childhood birthday party, they might remember the conversations, or the emotions they felt, or the specific details of what happened.
Exactly. And they might also be really good at remembering things like lists, facts, and abstract concepts.
I read about a study that looked at autobiographical memory in people with and without aphantasia, and they found that while those with aphantasia had a harder time remembering visual details of past events, they were just as good at recalling factual and emotional aspects.
That's a key point. It suggests that while visual imagery might be a part of how we remember things, it's not the whole story. Our brains have other ways of encoding, storing, and retrieving information.
It's like their brains have found alternative pathways for memory, bypassing those visual centers.
That's a great way to think about it.
And some researchers have even suggested that this could have some advantages.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For example, people with aphantasia might be less susceptible to false memories because they're less influenced by misleading visual information.
That's fascinating.
It's amazing how much we're still learning about memory and imagery
There's so much we don't know yet.
and the diversity of human minds.
Absolutely. And that actually brings us to another really important aspect of aphantasia, the ethical considerations surrounding how we study it, and the potential impact it has on how we view ourselves and others.
Oh, that's a great point. That sounds like a perfect topic for our next conversation. Join us next time for part 3, where we'll delve into those ethical considerations, the future of aphantasia research, and what it all means for our understanding of the human experience. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into aphantasia.
It's been a great conversation so far.
It really has. We've learned so much about how people experience the world without mental pictures and the amazing ways they adapt and thrive.
It's a real testament to the diversity of the human mind, and it challenges us to rethink a lot of our assumptions about things like thinking, imagination, even dreaming.
You know, something we've touched on a few times is the whole issue of language and how we talk about subjective experiences, I'm wondering if there are any ethical considerations around the use of the term aphantasia itself.
That's a really important point. One concern that's been raised is the potential for the term to be misused or overapplied. Just because someone has trouble visualizing doesn't automatically mean they have aphantasia. It's not a catch-all term for any kind of difficulty with imagination or mental imagery.
So it's not a diagnosis to be thrown around lightly.
Exactly. Self-diagnosis without a proper assessment can lead to unnecessary anxiety or people misinterpreting their own experiences.
It's a good reminder that we need to be thoughtful and informed, especially when we're talking about something as personal and complex as aphantasia.
Absolutely. Responsible research and clear communication are crucial. We need to make sure that information about aphantasia is accurate and presented sensitively.
Speaking of research, what are some of the most exciting areas of study right now? Where is this field headed?
One area that's getting a lot of attention is the search for a genetic basis for aphantasia. Researchers are looking for specific genes that might be involved in our ability to form mental images.
So could there be an aphantasia gene, so to speak?
It's definitely a possibility. And identifying these genes could really help us understand the underlying mechanisms and potentially lead to new interventions or therapies.
That would be incredible, to unravel the genetic secrets behind this phenomenon.
It would be a major breakthrough. Another exciting area is the development of more objective ways to measure and assess aphantasia. We talked earlier about the limitations of self-report questionnaires, and even some of the behavioral tests might not capture the full complexity of mental imagery.
Right. It seems like a really tricky thing to measure, this internal experience that's so different for everyone.
It is. That's why researchers are turning to techniques like neuroimaging, eye tracking, and physiological measures like pupil dilation and skin conductance to get a more objective look at what's happening in the brain.
Wow. It's like we're developing a whole new set of tools to map the invisible landscape of the mind.
That's a great way to put it.
So, beyond the scientific realm, what are some of the broader societal implications of aphantasia? How does understanding this phenomenon change how we view ourselves and each other?
It's a really profound question. I think aphantasia forces us to reconsider some of our most basic assumptions about human nature, like what it means to be creative, or how we solve problems, even how we experience empathy.
Yeah, we often associate creativity with this ability to visualize things.
Exactly. But aphantasia shows us that creativity can flourish even without those internal pictures.
So it's not the only path to innovation and inspiration.
Definitely not. And the same goes for empathy. We often think of empathy as requiring us to imagine ourselves in someone else's shoes. But people with aphantasia demonstrate that empathy can be just as powerful when it's based on verbal understanding, emotional resonance, and a deep appreciation for different perspectives.
So it's about recognizing that there are many different ways to connect with and understand each other.
Exactly.
You mentioned the Aphantasia Network earlier. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. The Aphantasia Network is a wonderful organization. They provide support, information, and a sense of community for people with aphantasia. They also advocate for more research and raise awareness about this fascinating condition.
It sounds like a valuable resource for anyone who wants to learn more.
It is.
Well, as we wrap up this incredible deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. If mental imagery is so personal, and language often fails to capture its full essence, how can we create a more inclusive and understanding world? Not just for people with aphantasia, but for everyone with diverse ways of thinking and experiencing the world.
That's a crucial question. And I think the answer starts with curiosity, a willingness to listen without judgment, and a recognition that there are countless ways of being human.
It's about embracing neurodiversity in all its forms and celebrating the fact that our differences make us stronger.
Absolutely.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into aphantasia. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the amazing diversity of the human mind, and we encourage you to continue learning and having these important conversations. Until next time.